Okay, good morning, guys. It's really great to be with you here. This Saturday morning Bible study for us is a real great thing. It's really great for me personally, and I wasn't able to be here last week, or I've been going through a time of a cold. Jeanette and I both at home have had a cold for over 2 weeks. We haven't been to church on Sundays for a couple of weeks. It's really been sad for us, but it's so good to have our fellowship together, and I'm looking forward to this today. After I'm done, I'm going to go home and lay down and crash for a little bit, but I'm starting to come out of the woods of having this cold, and thank you, Lord, for healing us, your people, at various times when we're sick, and you've been taking care of me and my wife, and thank you for that. Anyway, we all thank you and praise you for your good hand upon us. Pray today, as we open up your word, you'd speak to us in your word. Speak to us through these stories that we have of heroes of the faith. So give us your blessing now. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, guys. We're in the history books. 2 Samuel chapter 19 is where we're launching off today. We have been in a grand lesson of David the king, where he has, with all his glory, been showing us how to be a leader for the nation Israel. But he also has some shortcomings. We're going to see some more of those shortcomings today, I think. It's my opinion. As we read through this section, we saw David being on the run, leaving Jerusalem. His son Absalom had captured the throne and installed himself as king. And so his father David was a threat. Actually, Absalom was at war with David. And so David's running away. As he's running, he leaves a few people to infiltrate Absalom's inner court, and he's going to come out of this whole thing victorious over Absalom. David's plan of thwarting Absalom's new kingdom is going to be well placed here. But we see him today, we'll see him coming back to Jerusalem after some warring between Absalom and David. Actually, that's where we left off a couple weeks back when we were in our study. A few of you had contacted me and said, I wasn't on Saturday morning, and yeah, I was home, conked out with a cold, my grandkid's cold. But we left off where Absalom had mustered an army, and he was in opposition to David. He had sent the army off to battle David, and along the way, David had just enough time to put together his own response army, which came to him very quickly. Absalom actually had David and his people on the run, but there was a counselor David had left there, Hushai, who had bought David a little time to where David could put a response army together to fight with Absalom. Even though Absalom had been given advice by Ahithophel to chase David, he was on the run, get him while he's running. But Hushai, David's plant there in Absalom's inner circle, had won the day with his advice. And then Ahithophel, he had his feelings hurt. He didn't have his advice taken, and he killed himself. We left off with that last time. He committed suicide because They didn't listen to, Absalom didn't listen to his advice. Silliness. People don't listen to your advice. That's their business. Certainly don't do yourself in over it. So we pick up with David. He was on the run. He ended up in chapter 17, verse 24, a city called Mahanaim. This is an important city just on the east side of the Jordan River, north of Jerusalem, where in the ancient days Jacob had wrestled with Jesus, had a wrestling match with the Lord's angel, which was Jesus, I think. And it always has been a place where people would go and have a special place of honoring God. And that's where David ended up. So he was there in this town, Mahanaim, and while he was there, the battle ensued between Absalom's army and David's army. And chapter 18, Absalom actually was killed in battle. Remember the story where he was riding along on a donkey and went underneath a tree, and his hair was caught in the tree, and Joab found him, and Joab killed him. Joab being David's general for his army. Actually, Joab was David's nephew, son of David's sister. What was her name? It'll come to me later. Anyway, Joab did his David's son in, and then he put a stop, chapter 18, to the war between Israel and David, doing David, I think, a favor by putting an end to this war, because David was king over Israel. His kingdom was usurped by his son Absalom. And so Joab had done David a favor. It says, chapter 18, verse 16, Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel. Joab restrained the people. I think Joab was a good general for David's army. He was watching over David's interests. He put to death David's son, Absalom, who was usurping his kingdom. I think Joab was doing a good job for David. We're going to see, though, that David was not happy with Joab. So, after the battle, the information runners, David's favorite fellow that ran and gave him news of the battle, Ahimaaz, chapter 18, verse 28, he came running to the king and said, all is well. And David was very happy to hear from Ahimaaz. But there was another fellow, a Cushite, chapter 18, verse 31. He was the one who came and gave David, excuse me, my head and brain aren't working very well yet. Anyway, this Cushite came, and the king asked him, verse 32, is it well with the young man Absalom? Which was David's great desire. He wanted Absalom, though they were at war together, he wanted Absalom to be watched over and protected. The Cushite said, he's dead. And he's the enemy of my lord the king, and all who rise up against you for evil, may they be as that young man. He was dead. And then David hit the skids. Chapter 18, verse 33, he was deeply moved, it says, and he went up to his chamber over the gate and wept. He was so sad that his son Absalom had died. Even though Absalom was against him, chased him out of Jerusalem, put his own dad on the run, taking away his dad's kingdom, he was not a good son to David, and yet David loved him. So here's a message for all the parents. When your kids break your heart for whatever reason, and then they go and they have an embattled life, and maybe they even die, like Absalom did, and you're left with grief, much like David was up in his room crying, weeping, and he said, chapter 18, verse 33, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Many parents have felt like, man, I wish I would have taken my kid's place. And I would have had my life ended instead of my children's. Many of you have had this experience. And I just want to say, this really out of my heart here. God knows the day and the hour of each person's life and death. And it's in God's hands, and it's between that child and God. It's not between you, that child, and God. It's between that child and God. And all the hopes and dreams, the aspirations, the great potential that you see in your children, you can't enforce that on God. It's between them and God. And God decided it was time for Absalom to be wiped out and taken away out of David's life and away from pestering David and usurping the kingdom. It's a terrible truth. For David, it was enough to break his heart. And all he could do is think, God, if you would have just taken me and not Absalom. But that's what it was. It was God's time to say to Absalom, okay, you're done, pal. You're not going to pester my servant David forever. And I don't know if that's comforting to you, parents who've had trouble with your children going away from the great potential that you know that they had. Just remember, God doesn't have grandkids, he has kids. And our kids belong to him. Our kids have a relationship with him. They're his children. And they were just on loan to us for a while. Anyway, David was in mourning. And so, chapter 19, 2 Samuel, it was told to Joab, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And the victory that day was turned to mourning for all the people. The people had heard it that day, saying the king was grieving for his son. So the people knew there was this battle between Israel and David's men, and there was a big fight going on, and they knew there was a victory, but it was a shallow victory because the king wasn't happy that Absalom was defeated. So people went by stealth that day into the city, and as the people who were humiliated steal away when they flee in battle, the king covered his face, cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" He was in deep grief. Then Joab came. He went to the house of the king. And he said, "Why have you covered your face in shame, all your servants today, who saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives and the lives of your concubines, by loving those who hate you, by hating those who love you?" Joab really went out on a limb, and he rebuked David. He chastised David for this expression of grief that David was having over the slaying of Absalom. And he told them, you're being bad. You love those who hate you. And he said, you have shown today that the princes and servants are nothing to you. For I know this day that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead, you would be pleased. Boy, did he give a strong rebuke to David. He said, you'd be pleased if all of us were gone and Absalom was alive. Then he gave him good advice, heavy exhortation. Verse 7, now therefore go out and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, surely not a man will pass the night with you. And this will be worse for you than the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. So he told him, come on, David, get off this grief thing and go out there and be a king, be a leader for the people. And so the king arose, he went to the gate, and all the people said, behold, the king is sitting in the gate. And then people came before the king, and it's like it's settled issues. But it really wasn't settled, because David was mad. He was grieving. Boy, I should probably talk to you about how your emotions can ruin the day. If you have an emotion that's out of control and it's taking you away from being the kind of leader to your people and guide for the future, how things are going to transition and have your new future, if you're all emotional about it, you've got to change the way you think and feel. You may decide you're going to, go into counseling, have some therapy on you and take some medication and see if you can change your heart and mind. But what really you need to do is get a grip. God has a new future for you. And in this new future, you got to be a leader. You got to rise up. And David had such a hard time with this. This is where we can learn from David, who was the mighty king, what not to do. So what he did was he went back to Jerusalem. He started putting his rule in order, and he started guiding everyone, his inner circle. Verse 11, he grabbed Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, saying, speak to the elders of Judah. Why were you the last to bring the king back to his house, since the word of all Israel has come to the king, even to his house? Are you not, you are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? And may God do so to me and more also, if you will not be commander of the army before me in the place of Joab. So here's what happened. He went back to Jerusalem. He put his inner circle back in order. He started giving leadership, and then he replaced Joab. He was tired of Joab pushing him around and telling him what to do. And all Joab was doing was watching out for David. He had vanquished David's enemy, which David didn't care about, because David wanted Absalom alive. He didn't want him dead. But then also Joab went and exhorted David to do what was right and stop his grieving. So David said, I'm going to replace you, Joab. And he did it with Amasa, verse 13, who was again one of the nephews, cousins. They were all kind of part of David's inner circle. Amasa was the military leader. He was the general for Absalom. He was one of Absalom's cousins. Just like Joab, who was David's general, was Absalom's cousin. Amasa was a cousin. And they had all these powerful, strongly trained leaders who were watching over their military. And so David grabbed a hold of Absalom's general. This is, strategically, this is a no-no. You don't get into a war with the opposing group and then grab their general and their military leaders and bring them back to your group and make them leaders for your military. But that's what David did. He did it in his grief. He did it because he was mad at Joab. He did it, I think, because he thought Amasa was being faithful to Absalom, and he loved Absalom. He loved Absalom more than anybody else. And so he replaced Joab. It's not going to be an enduring replacement. Later on, Joab will come back, and he'll work for his uncle David, the king, and he'll be faithful. I think Joab is a great guy, personally. So here's David putting his leadership team back in order, and he took all his gang. Verse 15, the king returned and came as far as the Jordan. He's on his way to Jerusalem. Then Shimei, the son of Gera, this one who was pestering David, swearing, throwing dirt clods at him, he came and fell down before the king, verse 18, and said, "Let not my lord consider me guilty, nor remember what your servant did wrong on the day when the Lord my king came out from Jerusalem, that the king should take it to your heart. For your servant knows that I sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come to you today." So this rascal Shimei came and begged for his life. And the king said to Shimei, verse 23, "You shall not die." Thus the king swore to him. And so he gave him a reprieve from, acting against him. Later on, he'll tell Solomon to kill Shimei as he was dying, and given Solomon instructions. But anyway, after he put his own governing team together, then he reached out to Mephibosheth. Chapter 19, 2 Samuel, verse 24. Mephibosheth was Jonathan's son, David's great friend, son of King Saul, and David wanted to watch over Mephibosheth and couldn't do it while he was, running away from Jerusalem. So he was back there, and he grabbed a hold of Mephibosheth. Verse 25, he says, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" And so he said, "Well, my servant had tricked me." Verse 26, he said, "I'm going to saddle a donkey for myself and ride on with the king." And he left Mephibosheth behind. So David came and reestablished Mephibosheth. Verse 30, he reestablished all of Mephibosheth's wealth. Then he got a hold of this fellow Barzillai and reestablished him. He was a guy who was 80 years old. I don't want to really say too much about him, but he liked this guy Barzillai, Verse 39, the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him and returned him to his place. David was good to the people in his kingdom. So verse 40 through the end of the chapter, you see David reestablishing his rule in Jerusalem, and it didn't come without difficulty. There was rivalry, and there was trouble in the household, David's household, and David didn't really settle all those issues. He just let them happen. And so we have beginning now, chapter 20, we'll start it. We'll finish it off next week. We have David back to Jerusalem, verse 3, and he had his gals with him, and he replaced everybody. I'm not going to talk about Sheba. We'll talk about him next week. First part of chapter 20. But he got a hold of Amasa, verse 4. The king said to Amasa, remember, he was the general for Absalom's army. He said, call out the men of Judah for me within 3 days. Be present there yourself. So Amasa went out and called the men of Judah. He delayed no longer. Excuse me, I got this residual cough. And so David assembled these guys together, and Joab's men went out with them. And they tried to get involved in the procedures. Verse 8, it says, when they were at a large stone, which is a Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them, and Joab was dressed in his military attire. So here's the two generals who were fighting each other when Absalom was alive, Amasa and Joab. And Joab said to Amasa, verse 9, is it well with you, my brother? Remember, though, they were cousins. And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. And Amasa was not on guard against the sword which was in Joab's hand. So he struck him in the belly with it and poured out his inward parts on the ground, and did not strike him again, and he died. Joab, in his treachery, grabbed a hold of his cousin Amasa and said, okay, pal, how you doing? Here, let me give you a kiss. He grabbed him by the beard, and as he was holding him, he took his sword and put it in his belly. Now it came his entrails. And he stood there, and one of Joab's young men said, whoever favors Joab, whoever is for David, let him follow Joab. And Amasa, verse 12, lay wallowing in his blood in the middle of the highway. So there was treachery there with the boys. And then along came a gal, verse 16, a wise woman from the city, and said, here, here, please tell Joab, come here that I may speak with you. And he approached her, and the woman said, are you Joab? And he said, I am. He said, listen to the words of your maidservant. I'm listening, Joab said. And she spoke, saying, formerly they used to say, they will surely ask advice at Abel, and thus they ended a dispute. But I am of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. You are seeking to destroy a city, even a mother in Israel. Why would you swallow up the inheritance of the Lord? And Job answered, saying, Far be it from me. that I would swallow up and destroy. Such is not the case. A man of Ephraim from the hill country, Sheba, the son of Birchi by name, has lifted up his hand against King David. Only hand over him, and I will depart from the city. And the woman said to Joab, Behold, his head will be thrown to you over the wall. And so she went and cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Birchi, and threw it to Joab. Verse 22. And then he blew the trumpet, and they were dispersed from that city, each to his tent. And Joab returned to the king at Jerusalem, and Joab was over the whole army